Welcome, faithful viewer, to Paranormal News Today's Hidden UFO History, our ongoing series where we dive deep into the archives of previously classified UFO reports submitted to and investigated by Projects Sign, Grudge, and Blue Book. These three projects were U.S. Air Force initiatives created to deal with the wave of UFO activity that inundated the United States and the world beginning in the 1940s. Project Sign was first, with Projects Grudge and eventually Blue Book left as the only official programs investigating the UFO phenomenon. Ostensibly scientific in nature, the various projects' investigations often amounted to little more than following the Air Force hard line that UFOs did not exist, and anyone seeing or reporting them was little more than a crackpot. Many project investigators, like Dr. J. Allen Hynek, who were initially skeptical of the UFO phenomenon, later expressed frustration at the Air Force's willing denial in the face of extraordinary evidence. In January of 1970, the United States Air Force closed down Project Blue Book and did its best to bury the evidence and the truth. After decades of public denials, the Freedom of Information Act finally opened the project files and allows us to peer deep into the details of how the U.S. government responded to a phenomenon they were desperately unprepared for. After painstaking research and reconstruction of the accounts found within the archives, PNT is pleased to bring you another chapter in Hidden UFO History. July 7th, 1947. 4337 North 14th Street, Phoenix, Arizona. Mr. William A. Rhodes opens the back door of his home and starts to walk the roughly 100 feet to his workshop. The air is fresh after the recent thunderstorm, the rare gift of moisture in the desert intensifying the smell of creosote and damp earth. Rhodes hears what he thinks is the sound of a jet approaching, possibly one of the new P-80 jets the Army Air Corps has been developing at Falcon Field. Shading his eyes and looking towards the east, he sees nothing at first, but after a few moments, spies a strange object approaching from the northeast. Moving at approximately 500 miles per hour, it was elliptical in shape and about 30 feet in diameter. The gray-colored craft looked more like the heel of a shoe than an airplane. Rhodes was reminded immediately of the Navy's new Flying Flapjack that he had read about in the May issue of Mechanics Illustrated, but sees no propellers or landing gear on the craft before him, and unlike the Flapjack, it would appear that this object was flying backwards. As the object begins to descend from 5,000 feet in a slow spiraling turn, Rhodes runs to his workshop and grabs his box camera. An avid astronomer, inventor, and photographer, Rhodes seizes his chance and rapidly runs back outside and sets up the preloaded camera. For almost a full minute, Rhodes watches in amazement as the craft descends from a 5,000-foot altitude to 2,000 feet in a series of tight, spiraling turns before finally turning sharply towards the west and disappearing back into the clouds. As he watches, Rhodes takes two photographs that would become some of the first evidence captured of the UFO phenomenon. As the craft vanishes, Rhodes rushes to his darkroom to develop the proof of his strange encounter. That evening, excited by the results, he contacts the editors of local newspaper The Arizona Republic and tells them his tale. Offering to provide copies of the photos, they arrange for a meeting for July 8th, the following day. After a brief 3-minute interview with reporter Robert C. Hanika, Rhodes provides the Republic prints and parts of the negatives. Hanika, likely to verify the photographs' authenticity, sends them to aircraft identification experts for analysis. Curiously, there is evidence to show that on the same day the Arizona Republic submitted the prints and negatives for analysis, the commander-in-chief of nearby Williams Field Air Force Base sent Army Air Force's Counterintelligence Corps Special Agent Lynn C. Aldrich to obtain copies of the prints from the Arizona Republic. No doubt this was due to the massive wave of sightings in Portland, Oregon on July 4th, and of course the events in Roswell, New Mexico over that same weekend. What remains one of the many mysteries surrounding this case is how the military got wind of Rhodes' sighting. Did Hanika tip the military off by calling around for aircraft identification? We may never know for certain, but another curious point becomes clear upon examination. If the military was beginning to suppress evidence of UFOs in the scramble after the Roswell crash, why would they allow Hanika and the Arizona Republic to run a story containing the best hard evidence of the phenomenon to date? Curious indeed, especially when the paper went to press. On July 9th, the Arizona Republic prints Rhodes' story and the photos, but with serious errors. The photographs published were cropped enlargements of the originals. They had also been printed backwards, flipping the actual image. Standard practice in a business where space was at a premium, this was to prove disastrous for later UFO researchers. By cutting the negative and cropping the image, virtually all of the background images, plants, trees, and power lines that William Rhodes had included, and that might be used as reference points to determine the relative size and position of the craft, were subsequently removed. Now, whether this was simply the result of careless news editing practices or part of a government effort to obscure the truth about UFOs, PNT cannot say. What we can say is that this fascinating and tragic story is only beginning. Almost 2 weeks later, on July 14, 1947, Special Agent Aldrich files his report on the incident and sends the prints to the headquarters of the 4th Air Force, Hamilton Field, California, and also to the FBI office in San Francisco. At this point, the report and photographs slowly percolate through the dense layers of military organization, until finally, on August the 28th, Hamilton Field officials direct Special Agent Aldrich to conduct a joint interview of William Rhodes in conjunction with the FBI. Without waiting for direct approval from FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover, on August 29, 1947, Aldrich is joined by FBI Special Agents George Fugate Jr. and Special Agent Brower. The trio of men make the trip to William Rhodes' home and workshop observatory in Phoenix. The two FBI agents introduce and identify themselves, but oddly Aldrich stays silent, only identifying himself as a government agent. Under pressure from the trio of agents, Rhodes states that he still has the negatives of the first photo, but could not find the second. Now, if you've been paying attention to the story thus far, we know that the second negative was the one that the Arizona Republic was given. And this raises a question. Why would Rhodes either not remember or choose to reveal this to the agents? It is worth noting that Special Agent Brower states in his report that during the interview, Rhodes complained that the newspaper had blown up his story to, quote, the extent that he barely recognized it. Rhodes stated that the paper had completely altered the estimated altitude and speeds that he had observed. Rhodes was a qualified observer, having served at the Naval Ordnance Laboratory in Washington, D.C. throughout World War II. Rhodes had also been employed at Falcon Field, giving instruction in instrument training, aircraft identification, and gunnery practice. However, the agents seemed less interested in his qualifications than in his hobbies. According to Brower's report, Rhodes' observatory and workshop in particular were filled with electrical and astronomical equipment, early radio-controlled airplanes, electronic equipment, and the like. One man's hobbies that in this case would later be used against him. Rhodes, perhaps delaying the inevitable, makes arrangements to deliver the negatives that he does have to the FBI office in Phoenix the following day. Brower states in his report that he does so with the clear understanding that the FBI will be turning over the negatives to the Air Force, and that the likelihood of Rhodes ever getting them back is small. It would almost seem as though the FBI were already trying to wash its hands of the entire matter. Despite this, or perhaps because of the pressure on him, Rhodes agrees, surrenders the negatives, and returns home. Agents Brower and Fugate file their reports and send the negatives to Aldrich, who in turn sends them to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base and to the newly formed Project Sign. For the next several months, the Air Force and Project Sign officials subjected the negatives to intense study. Results indicated a solid object in motion and not an image artifact or imperfection on the film, and little else. Whatever else the Air Force found out about the object in the photographs, it was enough to send them back to William Rhodes. On May 11, 1948, 10 months after his sighting, Lieutenant Colonel James C. Beam and Alfred C. Ledding interview Rhodes at his home in Phoenix. Rhodes again reiterates his account of the sighting, providing various measurements and size calculations that he had recalled for the Air Force men. They asked for his camera, which Rhodes agreed to provide. Rhodes also mentions during the interview that he had spoken with another photographer in the area who had pictures of the craft, one Louis Larmor. Again, as in the previous FBI reports, particular emphasis is placed by the Air Force officials on Rhodes' electronics hobbies, and as his position as the head of the Panoramic Research Laboratories Observatory, which was the self-owned and titled company Rhodes provided on his business cards and the stationery that he later used to communicate with the Air Force and Project Sign officials. Despite later making snide notes regarding Rhodes' side work as a pianist at a local nightclub, and obviously not being impressed by Rhodes' company credentials, the two Air Force officers thank Rhodes for his cooperation and leave. 3 weeks later, on May 26th, the head of Project Sign, Colonel McCoy, writes to Rhodes requesting additional information and asking if Rhodes would be willing to travel to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base for another interview. There is no response from Rhodes. 2 weeks pass before Colonel W.R. Klingerman, co-head of Project Sign, sends Rhodes a teletype wanting an answer to Colonel McCoy's request. This time, Rhodes responds by telegram on June 11th, but sidesteps the request for an interview, instead suggesting that the Air Force contact the other photographer, Louis Larmor, who apparently had more and better photographs of the unknown craft. In response, Klingerman writes to Larmor requesting an interview and copies of his photos. Whether Larmor agreed or provided the photographs, we will never know. None of Larmor's supposed photos have ever surfaced, and no written record of his interview has ever been found. William Rhodes is finally left alone, wondering if he will see his negatives or the Air Force agents ever again. His negatives, however, continue to make a stir at Project Sign, soon to become Project Grudge. Throughout the spring of 1949, analysts pore over the negatives and Rhodes' camera. Sadly, the results, especially regarding the camera, have been lost or destroyed over the intervening years. As Project Sign dissolved into Project Grudge, the Air Force brought consultants such as Dr. J. Allen Hynek on board as investigators. Hynek was a well-known and highly respected scientist and astronomer. Reviewing the Rhodes report, Hynek came to the conclusion that there was no astronomical cause for the sighting and remarked that it was especially important for two reasons. 1, the photographic evidence, and 2, the marked similarity of the craft described by Rhodes to those seen by Kenneth Arnold over Mount Shasta. Hynek goes on to recommend that the Rhodes case be reopened so that if it is real, the physical data can be gathered before Rhodes's memory fades, and if it is a hoax, quote, this fact should be highlighted and even publicized to quench enthusiasm for the irresponsible reporting of saucers. Following up on Hynek's recommendations, on May 2, 1949, Colonel W.R. Klingerman, United States Air Force Chief of Technical Intelligence Division, Intelligence Department of Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, and co-head of Project Grudge, issues a memo to investigators providing them with FBI agent Fugate's report of the incident. Klingerman requests in the memo that the witness be investigated as to his standing in the community, the type and amount of business conducted by his company and with whom, and asks for an investigation into William Rhodes' social and professional status. To Klingerman's credit, he sends Thomas F. Doyle Jr. of Wright-Patterson Air Force Base to call on now former FBI agent Fugate and interview him regarding William Rhodes. On May 16, 1949, Doyle visits George Fugate. While stating that his interview with Rhodes was a bit hazy in his mind, Fugate, in what is an outright act of character assassination, proceeds to paint Rhodes as a publicity-seeking crackpot who was hoping to make a quick buck off the UFO phenomenon in order to support his expensive electronics hobbies. Hobbies which didn't seem to ex-agent Fugate to be appropriate to someone of Rhodes's quote-unquote station in life. He also tells Doyle that a friend of his had shown him a letter in a magazine that Fugate believed was from Rhodes. The letter purportedly details the story and asks the magazine how one might go about suing the federal government for the return of photographic negatives, which might be convincing, save for the fact that there was no such letter. While it is true that there was an article in the 1948 spring issue of Fate magazine covering the Phoenix UFO and William Rhodes' photographs of it, there was no letter, and therefore no basis for Fugate's character assassination of Rhodes. Oddly, Fugate here was perhaps being prescient, for William Rhodes did eventually ask for the return of his negatives, but not until much later, and not for submittal to a magazine for money. Doyle, concluding the interview, thanks Fugate for his information and leaves. Doyle in turn submits his report on the interview with Fugate to Project Grudge and Klingerman on May 19, 1949, stating that he will check on William Rhodes with the Phoenix Chamber of Commerce, Better Business Bureau, Credit Bureau, local law enforcement, the FBI, and, quote, any other source deemed advisable. Doyle also states that he will investigate William Rhodes' businesses, social and professional status. One wonders if at this point Doyle was starting to believe Fugate's slander, or simply being thorough. In what is either conspiracy or irony, Project Grudge, a la Colonel Klingerman, directs Special Agent Aldrich, one of the three men to originally interview Rhodes, to conduct the background investigation into the witness. Klingerman directs Aldrich to closely examine William Rhodes' business, the Panoramic Research Laboratories Observatory. Aldrich's search for information on Panoramic hits a dead end, likely because Rhodes never registered it with the city and did most of his business directly with his customers. Drawing a blank, Aldrich turns to Rhodes' police, banking, and credit records. He finds nothing to indicate that Rhodes is not an upstanding citizen. He has no criminal record and no debts. Aldrich then turns to his last resort, personal interviews with Rhodes' neighbors. They report Rhodes to be a thoughtful and highly intelligent, if slightly eccentric, neighbor who is entirely devoted to his electronics research. His wife was a fourth-grade school teacher, and the couple were involved in promoting science in public schools, organizing science clubs, fairs, and contests. Rhodes was well known for his skill in manufacturing the optics for telescopes, and this might help to explain the name of his erstwhile business. Rhodes held several patents for the invention or improvement of electronic devices. All of the investigations that Aldrich undertook pointed to the same thing: a well-liked and respected ordinary citizen in good standing, a man of high intelligence and verified experience that happened to capture on film one of the most remarkable events in human history. The trouble was, this wasn't the picture of William Rhodes that the Air Force wanted to paint. The picture that they favored was of Rhodes as an emotionally excitable, sometime musician, hoaxer, and liar. The one painted for Doyle by Agent Fugate. There was no question as to which of these pictures would become official Air Force policy, and it was not the one that was favorable to William Rhodes. It was little wonder that nearly 3 years later, on June 1st, 1952, Rhodes, perhaps with the assistance of nationally famous radio celebrity Drew Pearson, who had found out about the Phoenix sighting, contacts Captain Fournet at the United States Air Force Office of Public Information. Rhodes threatens to sue for the return of his pictures. In the intervening years, Project Grudge had given way to Project Blue Book, and Fournet now contacts them, sending a request to one Lieutenant Edward J. Ruppelt to handle the matter, essentially passing the buck to the saucer men. What happens next is a classic example of the right hand not knowing what the left is doing, as Ruppelt attempts to track the chain of custody of the negatives. The back and forth and lack of documentation at this point would almost be laughable, save for the fact that a man's reputation, already badly smeared by the government, lay in the balance. The difference was that this time, thanks to the media, it was public. In numerous documents, memos, and teletypes, we can see Ruppelt doggedly trying to track down the negatives, while the attention being given to the case by the media, and by extension to William Rhodes and his story, adds increased pressure for the Air Force and Ruppelt to deliver. Nearly 2 weeks later, on June 11, 1952, Lieutenant Ruppelt replies to Captain Fournet in frustration, stating ATIC has no negatives, and is not even certain the witness ever sent them, or just the prints. Ruppelt then follows the example of Fugate, Doyle, and Aldrich by accusing Rhodes of, quote, attempting to get on the UFO picture-selling bandwagon. In perhaps one of the few moments of clarity in his report, Lieutenant Ruppelt then goes on to state that if Rhodes can prove he sent the negatives to ATIC or to the Air Force and they were never returned, it may lead to a touchy situation. Ruppelt then goes one step further, making the breathtaking suggestion that Fournet provide copy negatives of the prints, essentially creating new negatives from the prints the Air Force had rather than submitting the originals. A copy of a copy made to look like the original. Ruppelt then passes the buck officially back to Captain Fournet and requests that he answer William Rhodes's demands. Fournet finally responds to William Rhodes' request for the return of his property by providing him copies of the filed photos and a letter stating that the original negatives were unable to be found in Air Force custody. Apparently, Fournet decided to take the high road and not manufacture false duplicate negatives. Unsatisfied, but unable to prevail against the monolithic forces arrayed against him, William A. Rhodes stood on what little dignity the Air Force had left him, and for years later provided numerous interviews about the incident to various newspapers, magazines, and television journalists. His story never altered. Investigations into the proof of his credentials, background, and standing in the community have only served to buttress his credibility and that of his account. For the remainder of his life, William A. Rhodes worked to further interests in science. Among regular contributions to the community, Rhodes took an early interest in solar power and in 1955 organized a solar showcase in Arizona. Rhodes went on to hold over 40 patents and was a prolific inventor of several devices well ahead of their time, including a prototype electric car with a range of over 100 miles and a top speed of 93 miles per hour. The telescopes he designed and built are still in use at Kitt Peak Observatory near Tucson, Arizona, and Lowell Observatory in Flagstaff, Arizona. Neither the United States government nor the United States Air Force has ever acknowledged or apologized for their investigation and smear campaign. William A. Rhodes lived to the age of 90 before passing away on January 22, 2007, leaving behind an overlooked but stunning legacy and a mystery that will endure for all those who pursue hidden UFO history. That's it for this time, faithful viewers. Be sure to stop by Wednesdays for PNT's Paranormal News Minute, and stay tuned to the channel for our ongoing series of investigations into hidden UFO history, strange mysteries, and our monthly review of UFO sightings from around the globe. If you like what we do, please consider supporting us on Patreon. Links are provided in the description below. We thank you for watching and ask that you click like, share, and subscribe below. I'm your host, reminding you to keep an open mind, because a closed one shuts out the truth.